Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be discussing how to make the character Moira in D&D, and this is Moira from the popular game Overwatch. She is a support class, but has some very interesting abilities which are more damage-oriented than most, and that's why we thought it would be interesting to do her in this style like we've done some of the others, is because she's not just a life domain cleric like some of the other healers would be.
And in addition to that, Moira's abilities have a very magical quality to it. It's not necessarily explained in the game, which is fine. It's a video game. But it's not like, for example, Soldier or Ash, where it's pretty obvious you have guns, dynamite, etc. With that in mind, Mara, this is going to get confusing because I'm talking to Mara about Moira, but we'll figure it out. Mara, what race did you decide to make your Moira?
For a race, I went with Elf, as we see from the in-game art and model that Moira is just very physically thin compared to most other characters and a bit lanky, so Elf definitely is what comes to mind with that, other than Scarecrow, basically. So,
any particular subtype of elf that you had in mind, or you're kind of open to what the player wants to do?
Somewhere Eladrin, due to the very distinctive orange hair.
Oh, interesting. I had not thought of that. And what background did you pick?
For background, I chose the Hermit trait, just because I figured that sort of isolationist and very inward-focused thing represents what the lore video and what the character's voice lines represent, where it's like, she will work with other people, but she's more concerned with her own projects. She doesn't have this greater good idea or anything. She's just concerned with her own stuff.
And no real sense of a team objective, just I will work with you because it works for me to work with you. That certainly makes sense. Now on these builds, we always go to level 10 with them, so tell us what classes you chose and what the breakdown is.
I went with a level 8 Shadow Sorcerer and level 2 Life Domain Cleric. Assuming I'm remembering right, that you do get your domains on first level for Cleric.
That's correct.
Okay, good. And the reason why I went with this is because the Moira's abilities in-game, she can heal, but she has a healing stat bar which runs out, and the only way to replenish that in a quick and timely manner is to do damage. So it's very clear that she's not primarily a healer. She has definitely some strong healing abilities, but they're going to run out much faster than Mercy, for example. And so her damage dealing abilities are these shadow orbs or a strange sort of vacuum thing, and spells like Blight and Vampiric Touch especially are what make me think of those. Alternatively, I think it's Tasha's Cauldron that adds Orb of the Void, and the Psychic Scream spell. Both of those, again, very, very on par for the character.
And what made you... the Shadow Sorcerer domain, it's kind of hard to imagine what other kind of sorcerer that character would be. Now, with clerics, obviously any domain of cleric is going to have some healing ability, so a case could be made for any one of them. What made you choose life domain specifically?
That, again, comes down to her in-game abilities, which is that she actually has the fastest healing rate of any healer, not counting resurrections, which is part of the reason why I think it's so limited. But when playing the character especially, I've noticed that I can heal my teammates much faster than if I played any other character. And so the life domain just represents that, because every single ability they have is completely broken for healing and only healing.
Well, that makes sense. That's certainly a very compelling build. I don't have any, there's nothing about that I would argue with as that not making a good Moira build.
Yep, the only other notes I will add is I chose light armor, and I also grabbed the Shadow Stalker feat because she has that fade ability that allows her to leave combat very quickly, but the Shadow Sorcerer and the Life Domain Cleric lacked anything like that. So the feat was the only way to really get that. And so what's your build?
So our builds are actually going to be fairly similar with some key differences. I went with a half-elf for similar reasons. I thought it was consistent with the appearance. And the way the book describes half-elves, the player's handbook describes half-elves, is that they are natural diplomats. And I actually really saw that in the origin video for Moira. She's dealing with a lot of different bad guys who potentially don't even like each other. So she's kind of this dark version of a half-elf, where she's great at making deals, just not necessarily with the best or the kindest people. And for her background, I chose Acolyte because that just made sense. She's somebody who's doing a lot of studying, doing a lot of research, and of course you pick up some neat in-game abilities. In the interest of not turning this into a 25-minute video, I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about that, but Acolyte background just kind of works for the overall character, and it's very playable as a background for especially a spellcaster or a support class. Now, as far as the class breakdown, mine is similar to yours but decidedly different. I did go with a cleric sorcerer build. I went with 4 levels in Shadow Sorcerer. The reason why I picked Shadow Sorcerer, interestingly enough, was because of the ability you talked about where she just kind of fades away. I thought that the resilience of the Shadow Sorcerer, where they have the ability that when they get dropped to 0, they go to 1, in a way kind of reflected that. I mean, it's crude, it's not exact, but it was something like that. And of course, her connection to death, her connection to blurring the lines between life and death certainly made sense to it. In addition, the spell list available to sorcerers includes like a spell literally called Blur that makes the character harder to hit.
Yeah.
And for the cleric domain, I chose actually the death domain. And the reason why was because that's just sort of the whole theme of the character, is that she's sort of playing around with the lines between life and death, dark energy and light energy. If I was to do the 25-page backstory that everybody absolutely wants from every character at the table, and we're all very interested in, hers would be something like she started out life as either a knowledge or a life domain cleric, but became sort of a Liliana Vess type character where she...
I was thinking of.
Right, where she sort of dipped her toe a little too deeply into the well of forbidden knowledge, probably originally for strictly academic purposes, but then, just went a little overboard with it. So, yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, my final notes are just that I almost went with a Wizard Artificer build, which we actually nearly discussed before this video started, but I decided against it because, well, I think that would be more accurate to the character's game lore in that the town Oasis map, that's where she's from. It's literally a city built just for scientific progress. But it doesn't fit D&D very well. The Artificer has no healing abilities, and while Necromancer Wizard is cool, it's also the least practical of all of the subtypes of Wizard, and I'm saying that while Illusion exists. So it was just, while I usually like to go a little heavier into the spirit more than the practicality, even I had to admit with this one, like, no, these abilities are really specific here. I can't just trade them out for completely different ones. So do you have any finishing thoughts?
Sure, I would just like to say that when you're porting over these characters for D&D, obviously there's a lot of maneuvering room, and if your DM wants to be difficult about lore, it's always important to remember that when you're doing with a medieval themed setting, artificers and alchemists and people like that would have been relatively rare. Where the real knowledge would have been held would have been in the nobility and in the clergy. So if someone has a noble or acolyte background, you're kind of covering it, and cleric would have access to their temples, libraries. Those were the storehouses of knowledge back in the day. So you're not doing the lore any injustice by not having this person be, say, a wizard. And as always, we thank you for watching, and we hope to see you on the next one. Please like, share, subscribe, etc. And unless something really exciting comes up from Wizards, I think what our next video is going to be how to make clerics fun in D&D.